Hello and welcome to Rebuild. This is a Rebuild Brick where I want to quickly talk about a conversation between Jordan Peterson and Dave Rubin and offer a biblical perspective on some of the things that they're grappling with. I'm going to play some clips throughout the video and I'm going to react to them. But to set the context, they are talking about Dave Rubin and his partner or his so-called husband's upcoming, I guess there's a birth of a child that they're going to be adopting. So they're talking about parenting as gay parents. But the issue in this video is not exactly gay marriage. It's the thing that is a common theme for Jordan Peterson, which is bearing the weight of responsibility as a necessary step to becoming a mature and fully actualized, his words, human. Okay. And just a real quick note here that I forgot to mention later on in my video. I am interacting specifically with their conversation about responsibility and putting yourself willingly under responsibility for yourself and others. However, I do want to point out that in this video between Dave Rubin and Jordan Peterson, they kind of assume that most conservatives are moving in the direction of being totally okay with the idea of gay marriage. And while I'm not going to address that part of this discussion in this video, I do want to just point out that there are plenty of us who still hold to the biblical conviction that gay marriage is not actual marriage, that marriage is between one man and one woman. And so just to get that clear here at the beginning so that we can now focus on what they have to say about responsibility with the rest of the video, just wanted to be really clear about that here. So what my thesis is in this little video is Jordan Peterson is very close, like he is on a lot of things. He wants to submit to, put the great responsibility of providing for and building into this world on his shoulders and on the shoulders of the people around him, and he wants to see that as a vehicle to find meaning in life. And what I'm going to say is you cannot have that truly until you have, first of all, put yourself under something more fundamental, not just the weight of responsibility, but under the authority and lordship of Christ. Okay, so here is the first clip.
So what really is the purpose of really living with somebody and really being with somebody and sharing your life with somebody is to build something lasting, something that you've learned and know and were taught, and that you can hand that on to the next generation, and hopefully they can attain and retain some of that
permanence in your life too, right?
Yeah,
that multi-generational permanence stretching indefinitely into the future.
So in this clip, they talk about the desire to build something larger than yourself, right? The desire to be connected to something more substantial than their own life, their own time on earth, and their own just area of expertise, not area of expertise, their own area of focus, right? Having a broadened focus and perspective on life, okay? Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, the Bible commends this idea to us. It talks about how God has set eternity in our hearts that we would seek for him. And specifically in the book of Ecclesiastes, there are some verses that are helpful about this. It says this in Ecclesiastes 3:12 through 14. I know that there is nothing better for them than to rejoice and do good while they live, and also that every man should eat and drink and find satisfaction in all his labor. This is the gift of God. I know that everything God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it or taken from it. God does it so that they should fear him. Okay? So here we see the idea in the Bible that the works of God are eternal and meaningful. And the theme in the book of Ecclesiastes is that under the sun, in other words, life here on earth as it is now, is vain, futile, meaningless. It has a sense of that the curse has been leveled on us, and we don't find the satisfaction or the ability to actually create something meaningful that the earth was designed to have. However, notice that key verse there, that key phrase there in verse 14. It talks about the works of God are the things that are truly eternal. Now, the call of God to the human in the fallen world is to not reject the world. In fact, Solomon commends, eat and drink and take joy in all of your labor. Okay, this is the gift of God. But rather, we are to find our ability to have a transcendent meaning by attaching our work to the work of God, because the work of God, according to verse 14, is eternal. So this desire is not bad, but we cannot build our own things. We cannot even build our own families in a meaningful way until we have attached them to the work of God. So that's the first thing I want us to notice. Let's take a look at the next clip.
But in a possibly more fundamental way, it's the union of two people to provide the foundation for children.
Right.
And I would say that's actually paramount. I mean, our society tends to flip that around, and we tend to think of marriage as something that, well, you find the partner right for you and you live happily ever after. It's, well, no, not exactly.
Yeah.
Or maybe exactly, if you also understand that living happily ever after means living for other people in many ways, particularly your children.
Okay, here we start to see really the core, one of Jordan Peterson's fundamental messages, and that is the idea that life ought to be about being responsible for yourself and for others, right? One of his big things is don't think that you can be responsible for the world until you can be responsible for yourself, but don't let that stop you. We ought to be responsible for other people. And here they talk about being responsible for a family and the fact that the family exists to provide a bedrock, to build a generation, the next generation. And again, this is a biblical idea. We ought to have this perspective as Christians about our families. The key here that I want us to see is their pivot from just talking about marriage to talking about the idea of bearing responsibility. And that's going to become more pronounced here in this next clip.
And you're constantly talking about the importance of family and the importance that for most people, and this is the way you would always say it, and it's hard to quote Jordan Peterson exactly, but something to the effect of that for most people to live a fully actualized life, that being a parent is a integral part of that. It is there's almost no exceptions to that. You would always make a point there are some exceptions. You might find
but you have to be exceptional to have an exception to that.
All right, so in that clip, they talk about the idea of becoming a fully realized or fully actualized. That's a completely I guess in Christian terms, we would be talking about a content or a completely matured individual, right? And Jordan Peterson says that this is almost impossible to do unless you are a parent, unless what you want is less important than your desire to provide for and take care of someone else. And this is, again, not an unbiblical idea per se, but just look at how he's finding the idea that our sense of purpose and satisfaction and contentment in life, which he will say in a few minutes can be incredibly difficult, incredibly hard. How do we make it through? Well, we find a meaning in putting ourselves under the needs of other people. And again, this sounds very good, but it's off, okay? But just notice the transition there from parents to providing for or building something long-lasting to now finding meaning in being responsible for somebody else. Okay, next clip.
I've often thought and said this, and I do believe it's true. It's very, very difficult to mature until you have children. And there are other ways of maturing, but it's hard. And the reason it's hard, I think, is because you're not mature until someone else is more important than you. And it's possible that that would happen with your wife, your husband, but not like with children.
Okay, here again, they just continue to drive home even more pointedly that being responsible, bearing responsibility. And what I want to kind of pull out of this is this idea that there is an expectation in Jordan Peterson's mind that we ought to meet. And that expectation is that we cast aside our own desires, our own, maybe we could say vices, the desires for vice, and put on the virtues of responsibility, of self-control, in order to be able to almost become subservient to or a servant of this idea of a greater responsibility or a greater good, okay? And for him, meaning in life and purpose in life and the ability to get through difficult times and to find a way to put one foot in front of the other every day comes as we put ourselves under this great weight of responsibility. Okay? Next clip.
Well, I think the deck is stacked against everyone to some degree because life is very difficult and we all die. So, but some people do have it harder than others. And all of us have it very hard at some times in our lives. It's like, well, what's the alternative? You take responsibility for that and try to struggle uphill because the alternative makes everything worse. It's not like it's fair. I know perfectly well that people have brutal lives. I've been a psychotherapist for 20 years. I've seen things you can't imagine, horror shows that you can't fathom, and people who have been hurt in so many ways, so many dimensions. It's like, bitter? Should they be bitter? Should they be resentful? Should they become violent? These things don't help. They have to struggle uphill despite their excess burden. And it's responsibility, not guilt. It's not necessarily their fault. That's not the point.
All right, so here he talks about the idea that even for people who are in great difficulty or have had a difficult past, the way forward is, in fact, to take responsibility for their lives. Okay, and I'm showing these clips because I really want us to understand just more and more and more deeply that in his whole understanding of life, bearing responsibility for yourself and for the people around you is the highest aim that we can have as humans. Okay, one last clip here.
You need a sustaining meaning to help you avoid bitterness.
Yeah.
And then the question is, well, where is that sustaining meaning to be found, if it can be found at all? And the answer to that seems to be not in rights and privileges and impulsive freedom and instantaneous gratification, not in any of that, but in the adoption of responsibility for the appalling conditions of the world at all of those levels, and then the determination to do something about that. And I do believe that people, as soon as you tell people that, they understand it.
Here he goes so far as to say that the meaning in life, the meaning in suffering, which for him is almost synonymous with life, is found in being responsible. In other words, responsibility almost absolves you, or it almost, not absolves you, but it almost kind of sanctifies or purifies the suffering or the difficulty that life presents to us at all turns. And it's this idea of subsuming or submitting yourself to the need to be responsible, the need to improve the world, right? And so please catch this. This is it's so Christian in a lot of ways, putting off your desires and putting on the responsibility that we ought to have as humans who are trying to be fully actualized, fully matured, fully developed people. Okay. Now, here's where I want to bring, just to wrap it all up, the Christian perspective. Okay. In Ecclesiastes 3:13, which is what we read earlier, there's a very key phrase there. It says that we ought to eat and drink and find satisfaction in all of our labor and work. Okay, in providing, in building. In the labor is not just for the sake of labor. The idea here is that you have to give to your family, to welcome the stranger, things like that. Okay, that this is what we should do. We should find satisfaction in this, and I see this very much echoing what Jordan Peterson says. However, the prophet here says something important. He says this also is the gift of God, the ability to enjoy the work that we do, the labor that we do, the responsibility that we bear here on this world, in this lifetime, is the gift of God. In other words, you cannot have the work that you do, the responsibility that you bear, attach itself to the eternal work, which we find in verse 14, the eternal work of God, which gives it ultimate meaning. Think of all the times in the Bible where it talks about how so much of what we do is like chaff, right? It's just going to burn up. It's like grass. It's like poor building materials, okay? The way that the things that we do in this world can become attached to a permanent, for a metaphor, a permanent building structure. something that will last for eternity because God is eternal, is if God gives you the gift of attaching it to his work. And that makes it an enjoyable process and not a vain process. Now, to whom does he give this gift? To whom does he give the ability or the position of building onto the eternal building rather than just a temporary hut? Okay. For this, we go to the New Testament. And so in 1 Peter 5, verse 6, we see this. It says, "Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time." Again, there is a promise here. There will be meaning, there will be value, there will be an elevation of your work. It will be displayed as having been eternal, as not having been wasted or vain or pointless or just meaningless. But who gets to do that? It is not the person that puts aside his desire and simply submits to responsibility. It is not the person who works out the classical virtues and has self-control and stoicism. The person who has been given the ability to enjoy life and to have the deeds that you do matter into eternity is the person who humbles himself not to the idea of responsibility, but to God's mighty hand. And this is where Jordan Peterson is most fundamentally wrong. He wants to receive the weight of responsibility. There's a good, solid weight of bearing a burden or a task or a responsibility. He wants to find his meaning in that. But he is forgetting that the first step to finding meaning is not submitting yourself to responsibility, but submitting yourself to the reign of Christ, the lordship of Christ. Okay? And so we know that Christ is the Lord, and all attempts to bear responsibility to do good things, these are, like Isaiah says, filthy rags. The fundamental position of a human that is the mentally, the most mental health that a human can have, the most thriving, the most prospering in their soul that a human can experience, comes when we submit ourselves to God. And any talk by Jordan Peterson or Dave Rubin that does not include this is missing the first step, right? It's missing the first step. The most fundamental thing that we are called to do as humans is to submit to God. And then in that submission, yes, he will put responsibilities and burdens on us. But in doing them, we're not submitting to the idea of responsibility, we're submitting to him. And this is the joyous position of the Christian. This is the joyous position where we can enjoy our labor, though life is difficult, and we can be confident that it is attached to the eternal labor of God. So, Christian, bear the weight of providing for your family, of leading your family, of raising your children, of working hard, of starting your business, of working in politics, of changing the world, but only when you have first submitted to God. It's the submission to God that is the normal operative mode for the Christian. And in my opinion, that's what Jordan Peterson has gotten wrong in this conversation with Dave Rubin.